Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rebecca Ford. I'm head of the design programme here at the RSA, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to today's special event. Before we begin, could I ask you to check that your mobile phones are switched to silent? We are filming today's event and live streaming over the web, so welcome to everyone who's joining us online. And a reminder that the hashtag is a really good one, hashtag RSAJoy, if you'd like to get involved in the discussion on Twitter. So now housekeeping notices over. It's my great pleasure to welcome today's guest speaker, Ingrid Fetell Lee. Ingrid is a designer and writer whose work focuses on the way that design affects our health and happiness. She has over 12 years' experience in design and branding, most recently as design director of IDEO in New York, and she founded the Aesthetics of Joy, empowering people to find joy in daily life through design. Ingrid joins us today to share the thinking from her new book, Joyful. In the book, using insights from psychology and neuroscience, she explores the power of ordinary things to create extraordinary happiness. And she argues that our greatest source of joy is the world around us, and that understanding the link between our environment and our emotions is key to happy and healthy lives. After her opening presentation, I'll be engaging Ingrid in some follow-up conversation before opening out discussion to the floor. And there'll be plenty of time for your questions before we wrap up at 2. So, enough from me for now, and please join me in giving a big and warm welcome to Ingrid Fetell Lee.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for that warm welcome. So I'd like to start today with, let's see if I can get the slides to go. They don't seem to want to go, but I'll try it this way. I'd like to start with an observation, that we pursue happiness, but we overlook joy. And what do I mean by that? So happiness, from a psychological perspective, is generally thought of as a broad evaluation of how we feel about our lives over time. So these words joy and happiness often swirl together, but happiness is really this sort of broader evaluation. It's cognitive. It's a cognitive appraisal of how we feel about our lives, and it often includes a range of factors. How we feel about our work, whether we feel like we have a sense of meaning and purpose in our lives, how we feel about our social connections, how connected we feel to other people. Even our genetics play a role in how happy we feel. But joy is much simpler, much more immediate. So the way that psychologists define joy is as an intense, momentary experience of positive emotion. And we can measure that through direct physical expressions. So things like smiling and laughter and a feeling of wanting to jump up and down. That's actually a technical thing. It's one of the ways that scientists measure that feeling of joy in a lab. And when I do workshops, I also hear things like a sense of lightness in your body, a sense of warmth. And someone recently told me it feels like wanting to hug everyone around you. So there's something that happens physically, viscerally in our bodies when we feel joy. So I think while happiness can sometimes feel a little bit vague, it's hard to know in a given moment how happy we are. It requires some self-reflection. Joy is much more immediate. When we are experiencing a moment of joy, there's no doubt. But I think we overlook this because these moments of joy often seem so small. They sort of pass by in the flow of daily life, and so we don't often pay a lot of attention to them. I think we don't really feel they're very important. And yet, they're really, really important and really powerful. And I want to share a few different ways that joy affects us. So the first is that joy is contagious. So all of our emotions are contagious. We spread them to each other through our tone of voice, our facial expressions, our body language. All of these are different ways that we spread joy to each other. We spread all our emotions, but in particular joy. And one of the side effects of this is that joy makes us more physically attractive to other people. And so one of the ways that scientists know this is that they take these faces, they look like real faces, but they're actually computer-generated composite faces. And they take faces that they deem average looking. They use independent raters to rate these different computer-generated faces. And they take average looking faces and they make them smiling, expressing joy. And then they put them against faces that are supposedly really good looking, like model-esque faces. And they have those, model-esque faces not smiling. And what they find is that the supposedly average-looking faces are considered more attractive, they're more physically attractive than the supposedly better-looking faces. So something happens when we express joy. We become more physically attractive to other people, and that makes a lot of sense, right? Because if we know that our emotions are going to rub off on other people, or their emotions are going to rub off on us, then we're going to want to be around people who are joyful. And another side effect of this is that even transient experiences can affect us in deep ways. So if I go into a store, you go into a store, and the salesperson is expressing genuine joy, you are more likely to give that store you're more likely to give it a higher customer satisfaction rating. You're more likely to spend more time browsing in that store, and more likely to say you'll return to that store. So small transient thing actually can have an effect on a business's bottom line. Joy also sharpens our minds. So I think we're used to thinking about joy as something that happens on the weekends, right? It happens on evenings and at weekends. It's a distraction from our work. But in fact, small moments of joy can affect our work in powerful ways. So for example, if you are going to see your doctor, probably the last thing you think you want to do is to try to make him laugh or her laugh. But in fact, that would probably be a really good thing to do, because research has shown that doctors, when they are in a state of joy, are more likely to come to the correct diagnosis more quickly. And they're less likely to be led astray by other symptoms that are not relevant to the condition at hand. So next time you go to the doctor, come prepared with a good joke. Same thing is true with business people. When business people are making decisions, research shows that they make more accurate decisions when they're in a joyful state of mind, and that they consider a broader range of scenarios in the process of making those decisions. And some research shows that we are up to 12% more productive. So this is research at the University of Warwick that shows that people are up to 12% more productive in a state of joy. So we think that joy is a distraction from our success, but that's really not true. It's almost the opposite. Joy also opens us up to new ideas. So one of the theories behind the evolution of positive emotion is called broaden and build. And the idea behind broaden and build is that our negative emotions evolved to narrow our focus, to enable us to deal with immediate threats to our survival, to our well-being. So that's why when someone makes you angry, you can't think about anything else, right? All you can think about is how mad you are and what you want to do about it and how you're going to fix the problem. Or in the middle of the night, if you hear a noise in the middle of the night, you're not going back to sleep, you're not resting at that moment. You're going to narrow your focus to find out exactly what's going on. So fear, anxiety, all those emotions narrow our focus in. But positive emotions, the theory goes, that they evolved for the opposite reason, to broaden our focus, to enable us to build resources for the future. And so being in a positive mindset is an ideal mindset to be in, to play, to learn, to grow, to explore. And one of the measures of this is something called cognitive flexibility. So when we're in a state of joy, we become more cognitively flexible. We're less likely to put things into rigid categories, and we're more open to seeing things in fluid ways, and that enhances our creativity. And lastly, joy makes us more resilient. So one of the things that small moments of joy can do is that it can counteract the physical effects of stress, the physiological effects. So the elevated cortisol, elevated blood pressure, and heart rate. So small moments of joy bring those measures down, and they help the body recover from the effects of stress. So I think sometimes when we get stressed out, we think, oh, I don't have time for joy or for play or for fun now. I have to focus. I have to, get things done. But in fact, those little moments of joy actually improve our emotional resilience, especially when we're dealing with difficult times. So in pretty powerful ways, small moments of joy can have big effects. And so that's why I think it's a shame that we often overlook this emotion. And I speak from experience because when I first, set out to I never actually set out to study joy. I really wasn't looking at joy. I wasn't interested in it when I first started out. I set out to study design. And it wasn't until a professor made an offhand comment at one of my reviews. He said my work gave him a feeling of joy. And this was unexpected for so many reasons. I mean, first, I was really trying to be a serious designer. And I thought that joy seemed sort of very tangential to everything else I was trying to do, to the real problems I wanted to solve in the world. So I didn't know any of what I just shared with you at the time, and I really thought joy was sort of incidental. But there was something else that caught my attention in that moment, which is that, you know, we think of joy as this ephemeral feeling, this intangible feeling, something that just sort of floats past us. That's certainly how I thought about it. I thought of it as this thing that just sort of floated past me, and if I were lucky, I would catch a few moments of it. But it wasn't something predictable in any way. And so I asked the professors, how do tangible things create intangible joy? Because these very ordinary objects I had designed, and they were pretty ordinary. It was the first year of design school, so they were very ordinary in terms of what I had come up with. But it was a cup, a lamp, and a stool, you know, and these are not things that I think we associate with joy. And they couldn't answer this question. And, you know, it was a whole panel of professors laid out before me. And this was frustrating to me because, you know, I think when you're in school, you expect your professors to have the answers. And so this sent me off on a journey. And I certainly didn't expect at the time that it would be a 10-year journey to understand the connection between the world around us and the emotional, the physical world around us and the emotional world within us. And as I started to try to investigate this question, I realized that there really weren't a lot of answers already out there. Part of the problem is that design is a very intuitive discipline, right? We come at it, we feel our way to answers in design. And psychology is a very inward-looking discipline. So the history of psychology has been very focused on attitudes, on behaviors. And in the last 15 to 20 years, neurochemistry has been, you know, an important part of that. But certainly not environments and the things around us. Those things have often been considered really not relevant to the deeper project of well-being and emotional well-being. And so for me, it was a project of trying to bridge that gap between those two things. And so one of the first things I did when I set out to do this was I just started asking the question, where does joy come from? And I went out into the middle of Rockefeller Center in New York City, and I started asking people about the things and places that brought them joy. And after a while, I noticed that certain things started coming up again and again and again. So there were things like cherry blossoms and bubbles, swimming pools, and tree houses, and hot air balloons, and googly eyes, and rainbows, and rainbow sprinkles. There was something about these things that seemed to cut across lines of age and gender and ethnicity. It wasn't like they were just joyful for a few people. They were joyful for many, many different kinds of people. It was almost as if they were universally joyful. And when I started to look at them all together, all of the different things that I heard, it gave me this really hopeful feeling. Because I feel like we live in a world, and this was true 10 years ago when I was doing this, and it's true now, that often seems really invested in reminding us of our divisions. We learn that we are right-brained or left-brained, that that conservatives and liberals think differently, that you know, you can be a Gryffindor or a Hufflepuff, and that those are, you know, fundamental differences in who we are and how we approach the world. And while those differences can be illuminating, right? We can learn things about ourselves, and they can tell us about our own uniqueness. I think sometimes they also have the effect of making us feel like our differences are bigger than our commonalities. And so to understand that underneath all of those superficial differences, there's a part of each of us that finds joy in the same things is really powerful to me. And actually, new research shows that when we are aware of the universals, when we are aware of things that we all have in common as humans, we are more likely to be compassionate to strangers. We're more likely to be kind to those who are different from us. So I think there's really something to this, understanding that we all find joy on a deep level in some of the same things. But I still needed to understand why these things. And so I had pictures of them pinned up on my wall in my studio, and every day I would come in and look at it. It was like analog Pinterest, right? This is many years before Pinterest, and I had this analog Pinterest board on my wall, and I would come in and move the images around and try to make sense of it. And then one day, something just clicked. I started to see all these patterns, round things. So all of the objects of childhood are round. Hula hoops, balloons, and balls, and carousels and merry-go-rounds. The list goes on. And even children themselves are round. They're like rounder versions of adults, right? And this is for good reason. You know, they have a higher percentage of body fat. They have round faces, big round eyes. It's one of the things that makes them so cute. And as we grow older, we elongate. We become less cute. And the same is true of baby animals. So there's something about roundness that gives us a feeling of joy. Pops of bright color. This is another thing that gives us a feeling of joy. And certainly if you look at festivals all around the world, there's always bright color. If you were to try to imagine a festival and make the decorations black and white in your mind, of course, it's something, just doesn't seem quite as joyful. Symmetrical shapes and repeating patterns. A sense of abundance and multiplicity. A feeling of lightness and elevation. These are some of the patterns that I noticed. And when I saw all these patterns all together, what I realized is that, yes, the feeling of joy is mysterious and elusive, but we can actually access it through tangible attributes, or what designers call aesthetics. And I think that word has often become a little bit loaded. We think of it as associated with beauty or with art. But in fact, the word has very humble origins. It comes from the same root as the Greek word asthenome, which means I feel, I sense, I perceive. What these patterns suggest is that joy begins with the senses, that there are things in the world that can trigger a feeling of joy within us through our senses. And so I began calling them aesthetics of joy, the sensations of joy. And I gave them names that related to the kinds of joy that they seemed to elicit. And then I noticed more of them. So for example, freedom, that feeling you get when you see a wide open field and you just want to throw your arms open and run through it. The feeling, that's the joy we find in nature and wildness. Magic, which is the feeling of joy we get from things that we can't quite pin down. So light shattered through a prism, optical illusions, the pulsing of fireflies in the dusk. Surprise, the aesthetic of contrast and whimsy and the unexpected. Celebration, the aesthetic that happens when in a moment of intense joy, like last night, you have the fireworks, our bodies, like the fireworks, burst open. The joy seems to spill out of us and can't be contained, and we often hear things like the pop of a champagne cork or radiating shapes like sparklers or these chandeliers. And renewal, the aesthetic of blossoming and potential and growth. So altogether, I noticed 10 of these different aesthetics of joy. And in the wake of this, as I noticed this, I found something started to happen. That as I went around in my daily life, I started noticing little moments of joy everywhere I went. It was like, I felt like I had like a secret decoder ring for joy. And now that I knew what it looked like, I was seeing it everywhere. It was almost like it had been hidden in plain sight all along, and I just hadn't noticed it. And so I started calling this joy spotting, inviting others to do it with me, and it became like a kind of mindfulness practice, but a mindfulness practice specifically focused around turning our attention to the joy that exists in the world around us and sort of bringing the world alive again. And as I was doing this was great, it's nice to be noticing more joy in the world around you. I was also noticing something else, which is that if these are the things that bring us joy, then why does so much of the world look like this? Why do we go to work here? Why do we send our kids to schools that look like this? Why do our cities look like this? And I think this is most acute for the places where people really have no choice about where they get to be. Nursing homes, for example, hospitals, homeless shelters, housing projects. How did we end up in a world that looks like this? We all start out joyful, and if you look at kids, you realize no one needs to be taught how to be joyful when they first, come into this world. The worlds of play and magic just merge effortlessly with daily life for children. But as we get older, being colorful, being exuberant, being silly, these things open us up to judgment. And so we start to hold ourselves back from joy. We start to act our age. And we start to separate work and play as if these are two separate things. Over time, we start to experience joy less and less. And I think it's really important to recognize that this is a deep cultural bias. So Goethe, in his theory of colors, writing in 1810, wrote that savage nations, uneducated people, and children typically prefer vivid colors, whereas people of refinement avoid vivid colors and try to banish colorful things from their presence. So there's an equation in there, a pretty insidious equation actually, that says that if you embrace one of the most apparent, salient aesthetics of joy, you are immature, ignorant, primitive. And none of us want to be those things, right? So it makes sense that we start to hold ourselves back from joy. And then at the beginning of the modernist movement, Adolf Loos, writing about, he delivered this lecture, Ornament and Crime, where he basically equated embellishment, and particularly the embellishment associated with many indigenous and traditional crafts, many of which were practiced by women, of course, that to indulge in this kind of decoration, to enjoy it, is almost sort of a weak morality. So, of course, not only are we holding ourselves back from joy, but we sort of hold it back from the environment as well. And so what happens is we banish joy to the edges of the world. Amusement parks, beaches, resorts, these are the places that joy gets to live, primary schools maybe, and the rest of the world is left to languish. And so the question that I've been asking over the past few years is, how do we bring joy back to the center of our world? And I want to share a story of inspiration from a city called Tirana in Albania. This story begins at right at the year 2000, when Edi Rama, a new mayor, is elected. And over the previous 10 years, the city had become rife with organized crime and corruption. It had been devastated by, a lack of sort of community engagement, you could say. So the treasury was bankrupt, and so bankrupt that garbage just piled uncollected in the streets. And so Edi Rama gets elected, and he finds the treasury's empty, but there's a small amount of funding appropriated by the European Union for historic preservation. And so he takes that funding, and this is what he does with it. So he starts painting these vibrant murals on the downtown buildings. And all different designs, and public buildings, private buildings, all different kinds of buildings. And, he would be the first to say that this was not about creating great art. Even though he was an artist by training, his project really wasn't about creating great art. But something happened in the wake of these first paintings. First, people stopped littering in the streets. And then, what he found is that shopkeepers started removing the metal grates from their shop windows and replacing them with glass fronts on their windows, because they said that the streets felt safer than they used to, even though there were no more police on the streets than before. And then people began to pay their municipal taxes. So nothing had been able in 10 years of enforcement to get people to pay their taxes, and now people were paying their taxes. And this allowed Eddie Rama to plant trees. He planted 4,000 trees. He refurbished the city parks. So he implemented a number of changes. And then 5 years later, so 5 years after the beginning of this project, the number of businesses in Tirana had tripled, and the tax revenue had increased by a factor of 6. And 10 years after, Tirana was at the top of the Lonely Planet's most desirable destinations to visit. So something happened in this period, and it was all catalyzed by color, something as simple as color. And as I went looking, I found other projects similar to this. So in New York, the organization Public Color paints neglected city school districts with vibrant colors. And what they've heard from school administrators is that attendance improves, graffiti disappears, and kids say they feel safer in these painted buildings, much like the shopkeepers in Tirana. And when I started to try to understand why that would be the case, I found research that shows that people working in more colorful work environments, and this is a study of 1,000 workers in 4 different countries, people working in more colorful work environments are more alert, friendly, confident, and joyful than people working in drab spaces. So though the color is just on the surface, it runs much deeper. The effects of it run much deeper. And as to why that might be the case, one of the theories is that it relates to our evolution. That when you look at environments that are capable of sustaining life, that are vibrant, they always have color. And when we look at environments that don't have adequate water or sunlight to sustain life or vegetation, they usually are lacking in color. And so color, in a very primal way, is a sign of energy, a sign of life. And the same is true of abundance. So that aesthetic of abundance I mentioned. Abundance, we evolved in a world, our ancestors evolved in a world where scarcity was dangerous and abundance meant survival. And so one confetto, which is the singular of confetti, in case you were wondering, is something you might just pick off your shoe, right, and throw away. But when you multiply it, you have a handful of one of the most joyful substances on earth. And you can see this in action in the work of Emmanuelle Moreau, who's an architect, and this is a nursing home she designed. And this is actually where the residents meet with their families. And what the nursing home has observed from this space, which is really, I think, surprising, is that families linger longer when they're in a space that looks like this than they used to before they redesigned this space. And some of these effects can even be traced to specific parts of our brain. So, for example, when neuroscientists place people into fMRI machines and show them pictures of angular objects and round ones, what they find is that when people look at angular objects, a part of the brain called the amygdala, associated in part with fear and anxiety, lights up. But this part stays silent when we look at round objects. So the speculation is that because we evolved in a world where angular objects were dangerous, and to this day they remain something to be cautious around, we evolved an unconscious sense of caution around these shapes, whereas curves naturally set us at ease. And you can see this in the newly redesigned Sandy Hook School building. So after the mass shooting there in Sandy Hook, Connecticut in 2012, the architects Fagals plus Partners, they knew that they needed to design a building, redesign this building in a way that felt safe. But they also wanted to create one that felt joyful. So they filled it with curves. They have waves running the length of the building and these squiggly canopies over the entryway. And even the whole building bends toward the entrance in a welcoming gesture. And this isn't just joyful, it's a security feature as well. Because when you have a straight building, you can't see what's happening along the length of it from inside the building. But when you have a curved building, the administrators in the offices on either end of the building can actually see what's happening along the full length of the building. So though it's a joyful feature, it's also a security feature. So I'll leave you just with this thought. I think we think of joy as an extraneous thing, but when we understand that it is deeply connected to our well-being, and that finding joy in the world around us, this impulse that we all have to seek joy in the world around us, when we understand that that is leading us toward the kinds of environments that can help us thrive, I think it becomes a lot easier to give ourselves permission to fight that judgment and allow ourselves to feel joy and to create it for others. Thank you.
Thank you, Ingrid. And first of all, I do just want to say what a total joy it has been to be immersed in this book over the past few weeks. I do really feel that I've come away with an abundance of insights that have led me to experience many more moments of joy in my own life.
Thank you.
So you've shared quite a few stories and examples of the different aesthetics of joy, and if you read the book, then you're taken on this wonderfully expansive tour around the world of so many different joyful places and objects and natural wonders. And I wonder how your research into joy has impacted you and the people and the places and spaces in your life. Perhaps you could share a few key moments of personal joy that you've experienced that have perhaps sparked bigger changes for you.
Sure. So one of the things that I think was really impactful for me was visiting the reversible destiny lofts in Tokyo. So this is a set of apartments designed by the artist and poet Arakawa and Gins, and it's a pretty strange place. It looks like a building that was built by it was like imagined by a child, but then it came to life. And so it's all different colors, the floors slope, but they had a really interesting theory about, what their idea was that architecture could reverse aging. And one of the theories behind it was that we have, many, many different senses. We have thousands of senses. We don't just have 5 senses. And so I think for me, going to this environment, being very highly stimulated for a moment, I came back very aware of not the problem of overstimulation, which I think everyone's always worried about, but the problem of understimulation. Mm-hmm. That actually being in very sparse environments makes you feel a little bit anxious. And I don't think we sort of think about that a lot, but I'm now very aware of that. And so I think about sensation almost as a nutrient, It's like a thing that, if we don't have enough sensation in our lives, then I think it goes other places. So I've noticed that, if I'm on a vacation where I am sort of experiencing a lot of rich sensations, and then I sort of go back to work and I really don't think about, nourishing that side of myself, I'll end up snacking all day, right? I'll end up sort of looking for that sensory pleasure in another way. Yeah. So that has really impacted me a lot.
Brilliant. And you also talk in the book about how people might be drawn to different aesthetics at different points in their life, and those might change over time as well. And I found myself very drawn to the energy and freedom and surprise aesthetics. Which ones are resonating with you most strongly at this point in your life?
Good question. I think for me, freedom is a really big one. I think living in the city, I don't think I realized how much I missed nature and the experience of sort of wildness in my life. And so recently we bought a cottage outside of the city, and I started a garden, and it was just a really profound experience to actually start a garden. So freedom and renewal together, I think, renewal is all about, that sense of blossoming and growth and potential. And I actually, this year, it was pretty funny, I started all of the seeds for my garden. I started them in my bathtub because in a New York City apartment, you really don't have much space. And so I had shelves in my bathtub and, started having all the seeds under lights. So I was able to get all of the plants for my garden started that way.
So another thing you spoke about in your talk just now, and you also go into towards the end of the book especially, is this this real challenge of people thinking that joy is superfluous. That it's a nice to have or push to the edges,
Right.
rather than being something we actively cultivate and put at the heart of our lives. And I love some of those stories that you shared around Tirana and Publicolor and various buildings that are challenging that. I was actually speaking to a friend of mine yesterday who consults with local councils here in London, councils and residents, on the redesign of public spaces, and she just wholeheartedly agrees with you that designing public spaces in a way that's specifically intended to connect with people's emotions, tap into them and create more joy ultimately in the environment can have this transformative effect on wider communities and people's behaviour and cohesiveness. But she also pointed out that getting serious buy-in from decision makers especially can be really, really challenging. I know, in the case of Tirana, the mayor actually led that change from the outset. But what are your thoughts on how we can change perceptions and turn design for joyfulness into an actual driver of change and something that's really embedded in the way people approach public space design right from the outset of projects?
Yeah, I think it has to be designed with people, because I think that I just met Morag Myerscough yesterday, who does a lot of work in hospitals, and she was sharing a story about how she really wanted to put vibrant designs in the hospital bedrooms in this children's hospital, and how she met with resistance initially, and so she went in and she made mock-ups of them and showed them to the children and the parents. And the children, it was 92% of the children and the parents wanted these more brightly colored bedrooms, as opposed, I think the fear is always that it's going to be too stimulating, right? But her point was that if you look at a child's bedroom, that's where they would be normally, as opposed to in this very sterile looking environment. And so she, by doing that and having the parents and the children involved, that then brought the nurses along and that brought everyone else along. So I think involving people in that process, it was the same in Sandy Hook, actually. They designed with the whole community. And they had representatives, the teachers, the parents, the town. So it was a broad range of people. And I think that really does help the outcome.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And actually, Morag Myerscough is one of our Royal Designers for Industry here. She's done a lot of work with our academy schools, and she's going to be giving a talk later in the month.
She's amazing.
On her
I
approach.
hope I didn't spoil her.
So in the book, you do acknowledge a range of things that can inhibit or undermine joy, whether that's in our health, our relationships, or things going on in the wider world. And I was really impressed by your emphasis on resilience and having this faith in the renewal of joy, whilst recognising that it's never going to be a kind of constant, stable thing throughout our lives. I think there's all this talk of resilience nowadays, and it kind of focusing on a sort of stoic endurance of challenging environments and situations. And I really found that your book points to this much more positive form of resilience and hope for positive change. So what would you say to people who might be in the room or listening today who are struggling or suffering and might have lost their appetite for joy?
Yeah, so I love that you brought this up, because I do feel that resilience has become almost synonymous with a slog. It's not a joyful thing. And I think recognizing that we can find joy even in hard moments, and that is a big part of resilience. And I think this is really, it's very personal for me, because I went through some difficult times when I was younger. I don't even think I realized this. I don't really write about this in the book, because I didn't even realize it while I was writing it. It wasn't until after that I realized that, my mother was very ill. I went through a period where my mother was very ill. And I think it was this sort of joyful connection to the world around me, and it would just pop up in very surprising moments, like a sunset. My mother lived on this hillside with a clear view of the Hudson River, and so I would see this sunset, and you know, it was when things were difficult, I still had access to that. And so understanding that joy is going to be a wave in your life. It is not a constant. Happiness is not a, you know, this idea of durable happiness is not what we get as humans. It's just not what we're wired for, you know. We're wired to sort of ride these waves. But if we recognize that joy will always come back again in some form, then I think we can focus more on the anticipation of that next wave, the savoring of the waves that have come before, and using that as our source of buoyancy, as opposed to trying to hold on too tight to something that may have, a joy that may have expired.
Yeah. Wow, yeah. I think that wave metaphor is really powerful. So I'm now going to open up to the audience. So if you have a question, then please raise your hand and also wait for the microphone before you ask it. We've actually got a question from Twitter, so right at the front here.
Hi, yeah. Our question from Twitter comes from Philippa Bannister, who is an RSA Fellow. And she asks, the emotional experience of place is often twinned with feminine sensibilities and therefore seen as less important. So how, in a predominantly masculine society, can we raise the importance of feelings, perceptions, and emotional responses to spaces and places?
Great question, because I think this subject of gender in design and how we perceive, you know, different influences, it's been coming up a lot lately, this idea that, you know, a masculine sensibility in design is very rectilinear, very hard, very traditionally, tends to be more muted colors, grays and blacks, and whereas the feminine is associated with curves and softness and vibrancy. And I don't know where that dichotomy comes from, but it does seem to be very pervasive. And, you know, we do live in a world that is primarily designed by men. You know, that is sort of at this stage, we look around us and much of the hardscaping of our world was created or envisioned by men. But I do think that that's changing. I don't know. I think the more that we see it, the more that it, you know, the more traction it gains. So I think in the US there's a space that I love. It's a club that I'm a member of. It's called The Wing, and it was designed by women, and it's sort of a women's only co-working and networking space. But it's a really interesting example of a design aesthetic that feels very feminine, but not, you know, what might stereotypically be perceived as girly or frilly. And so I think that seeing that, you know, and there are many men who sort of stand on the outside and wish they could come in because it feels good. So I think understanding more of the research about how space affects us and seeing more of these spaces built, hopefully will shift this from a, you know, a gendered conversation to this is just what feels good in a space. Yeah.
Okay, we've got a question on this side, second row from the back.
As design has been pressed into form follows function and utility is very important, I noticed much of your joy was spatial and colour and buildings, but everyday activities should be joyful. Designing, going to the bank or the social security office should be a joyful experience, so it's more a dynamic activity. I call it 4D design, but it never took off. Have you any ideas on this kind of dynamic activities? Should be, even every work activity should be fulfilling and joyful. Do you agree?
Meaning the question is about how we can make activities joyful, not just sort of the spaces.
Yes, right. So it's
yeah.
dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of that, certainly, I think that absolutely, it's not just about the tangible. The tangible is easier to show on slides, but, you know, I think it is about building sort of play and a sense of sort of joyfulness into these interactions. Some of that comes from, you know, one of the reasons I like to start with the tangible is because I think it provides opportunities for these things. So, you know, when you have places that have affordances that suggest joy, or that, you know, make a place more joyful, then it tends to bring out that behavior on the part of people, and then it sort of becomes contagious. But I certainly think there are opportunities, waiting in line could be a much more joyful experience, as you point out, and many sort of daily interactions could be more joyful as well. Yeah.
Okay, let's take a question from this side, middle section.
Hi, wonderful talk, and I love colour as well, and I've been to Tirana too. And your skirt. You must tell us whether you made your skirt or you designed it in a minute. But the question I have, we see that a lot of kitchens these days are very low-key, dull. It's thought to be uncool to use a lot of colour. People are dressing in beige or black, cream. Very little colour, except for people like us. I always wear colour, even though I'm old. But it's not thought to be smart. It's not thought to be, I suppose you're unsophisticated if you wear too much colour or if you design with too much colour. The buildings in London, we've got these huge glass, and like in New York, lots of glass buildings, there's very little colour, very, very little in the way of attractive design in a lot of our buildings, a lot of our homes and so on. Why is this that people are sort of frightened of colour?
Yeah. So I think that it goes back to that, that sense of judgment, right, and that sort of deep cultural bias. I think it's true. I think modernism bears a lot of the blame, and I am not very kind to modernism in this book. For any modernism fans, I apologize, but I am not very kind to it because I feel like that has been the aesthetic that has dictated a lot of what is considered sophisticated. And so, I think someone recently asked me the question, similar question, like, why did modernism catch on so much? I don't think it caught on with people. I actually think most people prefer more traditional, more innate, more colorful, more, that's what people tend to prefer. But modernism has been pushed by the design establishment. And I've even heard it from design students who tell me, I love color and I want to design with color. And my professor told me it wasn't good, that I'm not allowed to do that, that I'm not, that I don't look like a serious designer. So I think we all have this fear, and I think it's going to take some sort of modeling of behaviors, some, interjecting it. I also think that Instagram is changing the culture. I think visual culture is changing because of social media. It's certainly changed food culture. I think it's starting to change visual culture as well in fashion. And so I think that people are starting to seek out that, and that medium really carries sort of joyful design up to the top. So I think hopefully we'll see digital, that will be one positive way in which digital culture will influence us. But I think it's overcoming the fear of it. Yeah. Oh. Mary Katrentsu. Katrentsu. Yeah. I'll write it down for you after.
Okay, question right at the back, far corner.
Hi. Continuing off of the sort of theme of gendered, I wonder if also individuality plays a role in sort of discounting the role of environment in people's sense of well-being, because there's supposed to be a sort of, you talked about how in the psychology field, everything is supposed to come from within, and certainly a sense of resilience is supposed to come from within. And again, that might sort of relate to the sort of gendered notion that to be sensitive to your environment is to be sensitive. But in a way, that seems like even more of a cultural barrier to bridge than sort of accepting joy, is the notion that joy is supposed to come to some degree from outside.
Yes. I love that point, because I think, people, when I first started doing this work, I met with a lot of resistance from people saying, well, my joy isn't that. My joy is, I'm very, people, I think, often bristle at the idea that there could be a universality in joy. because it's supposed to be so personal. And so the way I try to explain it is that, it exists on 3 levels. Everyone has their own individual joys. There are probably things that you love that, many people who are around you don't quite understand, and that's okay. I have those too. And that's because we all have a different experience of the world, and we all have, some personality differences. And then there is a cultural level. There are things that are going to be joyful here that are not joyful in New York, and vice versa. So there are cultural differences. And then at root, there's this universal level underneath it. I think sometimes people bristle against that idea, and I often get the question, how do we design something that's joyful for everyone? Because I think that's a hard, it seems when you're designing public spaces, that I think what ends up happening as a result is that we just design for the unhappy medium. Right? So we just, instead of designing for any one particular taste or designing for, so actually understanding that there are universal principles that have to do with how our perceptual system is wired as humans, I think can start to circumvent that. But because that research hasn't really been organized, I don't think people are widely aware of it. Yeah.
Got a question right at the front, far right here.
Wonderfully joyful noise. When the subject of joy, what it springs to mind for me was, hide behind the thing, was also about kind of people in our lives and our relationships and our social interactions. And I wondered in your research, or almost what your advice would be to both bring more joy to our relationships and our interactions, and equally how to seek it out more.
Hugely important thing, and I don't always talk about it. I don't forefront it because I think, as a designer, my focus is on the tangible, and I think that's the thing that has been less discussed. Whereas I think relationships is a sort of, there's a whole field of social psychology that's devoted to that. But I think that our surroundings can also enhance our relationships, and I think, for example, one of the things that's really powerful is music. And any kind of coordinated movement. And so, my husband and I do a happy dance every Friday, or when something really good happens. And I think celebration in all forms is really powerful. So one of the things that I've learned from the social psychology literature is that there are different ways you can celebrate or not celebrate. There are different ways you can sort of greet someone else's news. And they sort of fall along these spectrums. So there's an active and passive, and there's a constructive and destructive. And so if you imagine that, when someone comes to you with good news, you could either be sort of passive and destructive, which is like, oh, good for you. Or you could be, wow, that's so exciting, I'm so happy for you, and really get into build on it and get into the celebration. Well, what they find is that when you celebrate in an active, constructive way, not only does your sense of joy increase, but you deepen the relationship. And couples who sort of celebrate each other's good news in this way, celebrate each other's joy in this way, tend to have higher marital satisfaction. So I think there are a lot of things we can do, but I focus on the joy side of it. And so I think heightening the joy that you find in celebration, and then I think bringing music, dance, all those kinds of joyous experiences into daily life is another way that's really powerful. Mm-hmm.
I also loved you drawing on your own personal experience and your relationship of surprise and what an important role that's played. Mm-hmm. Even, as simple as just leaving a little post-it with a note.
Yeah. So what Rebecca's referring to is when my husband went away on a long camping trip right after we got married. It was like a 12-day trip, and he wasn't going to be able to talk to me the whole time because he was out in the woods. And so I was really sad. And then I was putting on my scarf, and I felt this crinkle, and I found a little note. And it just said, "I love you so much," And then I started finding them all over the house. But there are all sorts of, when you you can use surprise as another way to connect with people you love, and leave little surprises. Someone else was telling me that his mom hides $5 bills in his coat whenever he goes home, and it's just like a really joyful. He's actually a magician, so it's a really wonderful thing. It's like she makes things appear in his life. So there are all sorts of joy. Once you start to get into it, anything you can do for yourself, you can also do for other people.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I think we might have time for just one or two final questions. I'll take one from the front here, and the lady, third row from the back on that side.
You mentioned social media as a beneficial influence, but doesn't it have a downside? It promotes a very shallow and cardboard version of happiness as opposed to the pursuit of true joy.
Good question. So I think that it has, that was sort of one example of, I think, a way that it can be used positively, but I think it absolutely can be used negatively as well. And I think that, my biggest problem with it is that it takes us out of our experience, our connection to the physical world. That we're sort of living in this increasingly dematerialized world. And so I think that is one of the issues with it. I also think that, when you talk about celebration, so much of the power of celebration is in the sort of the physical experience of it, being present. And when, what happens now is, it's someone's birthday and you send them a text with a little emoji. If you're lucky, you get the champagne emoji, or you might get the party hat, But that's what passes for celebration. That's what passes for communal joy these days. So I think that's dangerous. So I think, like anything, it has positives and negatives. I agree there are a lot of negatives to digital technology as a whole, not just social media. And I'm really hopeful that as technology advances, we'll see augmented reality interfaces that start to bring us back into the physical world, so we're not spending so much time interacting with these screens. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think this is going to have to be our final question. Yes.
I just wanted to ask how your approach allows for the pleasure of melancholy. And also, I'd like to ask you about spirituality, because if you think of the Greek temples, they used to be brightly coloured.
Yes.
And to be frank, I would abhor them returning to that. They are beautiful as ruins, as white, with their stone. And similarly, for some of our Gothic cathedrals, it would be horrendous if colour was inflicted on them.
Sure. Okay, so let me take the first point, the pleasure of melancholy. So I think what's really important in all of this is when I say that joy is not about the pursuit of a durable happiness, I think it's because what's really important is to be able to feel the full range of human emotion and full range of human experience. And so we're not meant to be in, happily ever after is not a real thing, because we're not meant to be in this constant blissful state. We're supposed to feel the rise and fall of our emotions, because those emotions give us really important information about what's happening around us and what's happening in our lives, and we can learn from them. And so to me, I think the pleasure of melancholy to me is very related to a feeling that the Japanese call mono no aware, which has to do with the transience of things and the sort of sadness they feel at seeing the cherry blossoms, because they're there for such a short period of time, and you have this intense joy and this intense sadness all at the same time. So I think there's room for a wide range of things. I also think that sadness becomes the weight against which our joy can be measured. So if we never feel sadness, we have no intensity of joy. And so I think those two things are really important to feel in concert. As to the spirituality question, so color, I don't think, is appropriate everywhere. And that's the reason that in the book there are 10 aesthetics of joy, and it's not to say that all of them belong everywhere. If the ancient Greeks intended those temples to be brightly colored, then maybe that's how they want them. If we don't want them that way now, then I think that's also appropriate, because there's so much in those experiences. So for example, there's a lot of harmony, which has to do with symmetry and balance and proportion emotion that we can find joy in, even if there's no color. And a lot of the, the Gothic cathedrals have stained glass, so they have color in them, but it's not to say that they should be painted. So I think there are a lot of different ways to create joy, and it's a palette, it's a range, as opposed to a single approach.
And I think that's also something that is actually really well illustrated through the toolkit that you provide at the back of the book, which outlines that entire palette with some practical examples as well. So I think we could go on all day, but I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Thank you, and thank you all for your excellent questions. I do want to say that my grandmother, who died last year, had a framed postcard in her living room that said, "Don't postpone joy." And I think that the kind of insights that you've shared have really inspired me not to postpone savouring and cultivating more moments of joy in my life. And I'm sure that you've had the same impact on many others in the room today and listening. So I'm very sorry if you didn't have a chance to ask your question, but Ingrid will actually be staying for a short while now to sign some books. So do take that opportunity to say hello to her and get your own signed copy of Joyful. And finally, please join me in a big round of applause for our brilliant speaker, Ingrid.